To the cloud. Okay. All right. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the fourth Talent Cafe of 2020. As I've said in the first couple of Talent Cafes, it's really cool that we can do this virtually at the moment. It allows us access to international experts all around the world. One of whom is joining us today, Raath from 21st Century, is an expert in remuneration and all sorts of things in that particular space, which I am not an expert in. So I don't want to waste anybody's time. So I'm going to hand over to Craig to start his presentation. If you want to introduce yourself a little bit, I think most people have read your profile and have seen the thing, so it's often quite uncomfortable to sort of blow your own horn. But you're welcome to introduce yourself and then get straight into it. Thank you, Craig, for joining us.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Kun. So, yeah, it is rather uncomfortable talking about a bio, but maybe just to say that I've been in remuneration for about just over 20 years now. Started in London with Deutsche Bank. I got back from scuba diving and surfing through Indonesia, back to London, and ended up purely by accident in the remuneration department and the global compensation team of Deutsche Bank, and was there for 5 years before coming back to South Africa, and been with 21st Century for about 15 years now. And we consult sort of end to end in the human capital space, but we really built a pretty strong brand in remuneration. So what I'm going to talk about today is governance and transparency of remuneration. But these are, you know, it's a mixture of what we're seeing in the market, and unfortunately, and Kun and I were talking yesterday, saying, you know, we're a bit tired of COVID, but unfortunately, COVID isn't tired of us. So so all of the conversations that we're going to be having are unfortunately have got a COVID lens on them, because it's here to stay for a while, and it is fundamentally impacting employee value propositions and the way organizations are doing businesses, structuring themselves, interacting. So unfortunately, it's difficult to have a conversation like this without bringing COVID into it. You know, just reading the news today, I see that Oxfam are predicting that 12,000 people a day could die of starvation because of this COVID thing in the world. So it's frightening. In South African context, Edcon and Comm, two massive companies, filed for bankruptcy pretty early on in the pandemic. Some top restaurants have closed permanently. We've just had one of our best private schools go bankrupt and lay everyone off. And that's, you know, without even talking about the hotel and the travel sector, which is affecting all of us. So, you know, we need to look at the situational context of the talk I'm going to give today, and it's what we're seeing is that between 20 and 40% of organizations are actually laying staff off after remuneration freeze, and certainly 20 and 40%. Sorry, guys, I just want to move your pretty faces so I can see my presentation easier. You know, looking at a 20 to 40% reduction in numbers. So it's a frightening place. And what we are seeing is we're seeing a shift from freezing pay now, because that's happened. If you haven't put in pay information to protect cash flow and sustainability of your business, then unfortunately that horse has bolted. And now we're getting into the restructuring side of things, which is a very scary place when you look at the projected job losses, etc. So governance is really becoming more and more in the spotlight, and particularly around executive pay, which is already at rampant levels in a lot of areas, particularly in a country with a high Gini coefficient. And I know that South Africa and Namibia have got that. So another thing that we're seeing a lot is that dividends are being frozen. This is a global trend. A lot of organizations have chosen not to pay dividends until we get out of this the cycle. And also large bonus payouts. And I think I'll focus on it somewhere else. But one sort of word of caution is to be careful of shifting the money around between guaranteed pay, short and long-term incentive scheme, because with the markets having tanked largely, a lot of share prices are down, and we just need to be very, very careful of shifting short-term remuneration into a long-term bucket at lower share prices, because we certainly don't want to see executives gaining and in some cases gaining fundamentally in a year's time from a pandemic and a crisis. So it's very, very important to look at some sort of value weighted measure or a pre-COVID share price. And another thing that we're seeing is that organizations are hesitant to pay out bonuses, even if you earned them pre-COVID. And a lot of financial year ends end up in February. We went into lockdown in March in South Africa. So even for backward-looking bonus payments, the optics aren't always brilliant in terms of paying them out. So organizations are treading very, very carefully around that. And I do have a couple of slides around the trends and what we're seeing. Perhaps before I carry on, please feel free to jot things down in the chat box if you've got any questions, or just shout. I'll struggle to monitor in presentation view if you put your hand up. But perhaps if you could maybe take a look and see if anyone's got a question, or just button or type something in the chat box. I'm more than happy to stop and give my views on any comments.
For sure, I'll butt in.
Thanks. And when talking governance, it's pretty difficult to have that conversation in isolation. And in South Africa, and I know a lot of countries, certainly in Africa and even globally, funny enough, ascribe to the King Code of good governance practices. I know in Namibia there's NAM Code that I think is quite closely aligned. So this is a King 4, and just in my experience, King 3 was a vast improvement on King 2, and really saw a lot of organizations going to adopting it. What King 4 does is it's actually less prescriptive, but it focuses more on measuring remuneration at a stakeholder level, and being more robust in how remuneration is paid out, and we're going to unpack that in a few slides time as well. So perhaps if I just read it. The governing body should ensure that the organization remunerates fairly, responsibly, and transparently, so as to promote the achievement of strategic objectives and positive outcomes in the short, medium, and long term. Now, those are quite broad statements. Fair pay alone is a pretty difficult one to unpack, and even with equal pay legislation in place, it's very, very silent, and we've done this study in multiple countries. It's quite silent on the width of the pay, and how wide those pay scales can be. So let's perhaps unpack that a little bit further. These 7 trends actually came from an article that my CEO and an economist that works for us wrote, and I want to spend a bit of time going through them. And these were written pre-COVID, so it's a lot of these things have exacerbated, and I think they are going to get more focus post the pandemic, because as you'll see as we go through them, they're all talking about responsibility and ethics around pay, which I'm incredibly passionate about, is the ethical side of remuneration. So let's look at the first trend, defining the purpose of the business more overtly. And this was something that was started by a business roundtable. It's a global movement, and it was actually signed by 150 top blue chip CEOs. And what they signed was a statement on the purpose of a corporation. And if you'll allow me, I just want to actually read what the statement says, because it's quite profound. The purpose of the organization should include all of the following: delivering value to customers, investing in employees through training and education, remunerating them fairly, fostering diversity and inclusion, dignity and respect, treating suppliers ethically and fairly and including diversity and inclusion, supporting the communities in which we work, and embracing sustainable practices across our business. And finally, generating long-term value for shareholders through transparency and effective engagement with shareholders. Now, that is a fundamental shift that we have seen in the last relatively short period globally, in this focus on ethical remuneration. No longer is it just about returns for shareholders, perhaps with a CSR department, so that you are exhibiting corporate social responsibility in your spend, but there's a true focus on the broader than shareholders. And that actually brings me to my second trend that I'd like to go through, and that is that the world is no longer focusing on what we call shareholder capitalism, where you are literally looking at who sits around the board and who the shareholders are, and making decisions to deliver maximum value to shareholders. And there is a strong move to stakeholderism. And stakeholderism is looking at employees, society, consumers, suppliers, financiers, governments, the environment, which is an exciting one for me. You know, I'm a complete bird nerd and wildlife nut, and environment is something that's pretty close to my heart, and I'm seeing those measures being built into remuneration reports, which I think is quite exciting. And I'm gonna discuss a little bit later, the triple P as a principle, and I think that's incredibly exciting in the triple bottom line. If there are no questions, I'll go onto the next trend that we're seeing. Executives will be hang on, I read the wrong one. Executive variable pay will be redesigned to align it with Principle 14 outcome of long-term value creation. The way that this is going to happen is that, and we do a lot of designing of these schemes, in terms of organizations putting them in place. So we do a lot of research around what is getting measured, and we've got a very good idea on the changes that are coming in the long-term incentive scheme space. And what we are seeing is that the measures are including ESG measures, or the triple P, which I'll come to, longer holding periods. So at the moment, King is, it's funny. There should be a vesting period, and we've spoken between 3 and 7 years, but because the 3 years was suggested in King 3, suddenly the market almost overnight migrated to designing everything with a 3-year vesting period, because it was in black and white. But what we are starting to see is a move away to a longer holding period, to ensure that long-term and sustainable performance is being measured and rewarded. Minimum shareholding requirements of getting more attention and being put in place. So you can imagine that Remcos are having a far greater say in the pay of the organization, and they are being held to account far more than they used to be, and they've got a far greater fiduciary duty as a committee of the board. So, and then another thing, as well as the longer holding periods, minimum shareholding, there's a focus on transparent reporting. And there's a very exciting change that I'm also going to come to about the 2 votes on remuneration that has had a real fundamental impact on remuneration reporting. And perhaps just a focus, and one of the things that come out of King 4 is that we've got in our report on the triple bottom line. So not just profit, but also broader social responsibility measures as well. On to the next one. Executives will be held accountable for sustainable performance by introducing both malus and clawback provisions in variable pay designs. I call it malus. I've heard people call it malus and malus and all sorts of things, but I'm going to stick with malus until someone corrects me on this forum. But I think everyone's familiar with what clawback is. And I'm not sure if you've got local examples, but I can think of quite a few examples where executives have left organizations in a worse state than when they started, and have got a balloon payment at the end, or have received multi-million rand bonuses, and then left the organization in a state worse than when they started. And that is just not on. So what scheme designs are doing is they are building this malus and clawback into it. And a clawback kicks in after someone's left an organization, where you can actually recoup funds paid to someone if there's been negligence or corruption or anything like that in the system. Malus is the same thing, but the nice thing about malus is that you can actually change the measures of a scheme pre-payout. So you don't get into a situation where you've got to go to court and fight for funds that may have been spent, and you take a while to prove your case. Malus actually allows you to change the measures pre-payout if there are behaviours that shouldn't be rewarded. The next one, the end of golden parachutes. So I alluded to it in the trend before. These balloon payments at the end of a tenure. Design your scheme correctly in the beginning. Don't pay these ridiculous payments on exit. I mean, what value do you get as an organization by paying a huge exiting bonus? It doesn't make sense. And let's remember that any incentive scheme in place is there to drive behavior, not as a discretionary bonus at the end of a period. It's in place to know that should certain well thought out and measurable steps be achieved, there's a reward at the end of it. So what we're also seeing is that short-term project-based incentives are certainly in the large, not as popular as they used to be. We still see it in areas like construction, where it's very much a project-based businesses, but certainly not multiple incentive payments measuring different things in the executive pay space. The next one, a move to simplifying executive variable pay schemes. We always it's funny when designing an incentive scheme, we often get this request from clients: do not overcomplicate this thing. You know, we want to be able to calculate it on the back of the cigarette box. And then you go back and you show them this first show, and they say, no, you got to add this and you got to add that, and we didn't think of this and we didn't think of that, and the next thing you've got this big complicated financial model that no one bloody understands. But there's definitely a move to simplifying schemes. And the reason is simplifying schemes is not so that the beneficiaries of the schemes can understand it so much, in that in complying with the transparency that's inherent in good governance around pay, Joe Public needs to be able to take a look at payouts and remuneration reports, and they need to tie it back to the financials of the organization. So none of this Houdini-like calculations. It's amazing how many REM reports that I still read, but less so, where I try and work out an LTI scheme, and I've been doing this for 20 years, and I cannot work out and tie back to performance. So this trickery and hiding stuff is going to become a thing of the past. The final one now is one that's more multi-layered than the other ones. There will be a strong focus on changing the remuneration strategy in companies to include a section on fair and responsible pay. Now, you'll remember that Principle 14 was very big on this fair and responsible pay. And there are a number of elements that go into this. I can tell you on last count, about 2/3 of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange had already incorporated this fair and responsible pay section into remuneration policies, and it is getting implemented broader than that. But the kind of things you need to debate when looking at fair and transparent pay is things like what is a living wage, and that's a massive global debate. A lot of first world organizations have got mechanisms in place where a minimum livable wage is getting paid. Now, the reason that livable is important is that less advanced economies have got living wage legislation in place. But I think we all know the answer to the next question that I'm going to ask is a minimum wage a living wage? And there's a ton of research that's being done on this globally. We've got a university here who's partnered up with a university in New Zealand, and they put up regular papers on this. And there's an international science conference that's run at the CSIR every year, and I talk at that every year, talking about this living wage, and the gap is just too big. But there's an economic problem with closing it as well. So it's a hell of a contentious thing. But organizations are going to need to start looking at this, and we need to get closer to that living wage. Another question is, should companies have a minimum level of benefits in place? One that I'm actually going to end this presentation on is the wage gap. How are you managing the wage gap? And more importantly for me, what is a wage gap? What is your wage gap? How do you measure the wage gap? And how do you look at the organization next door and compare wage gaps? Because there are so many measures of wage gaps. If you use a Gini coefficient as an example, you're measuring the difference between the top and the bottom paid employee. So what if you outsource your cleaning? Suddenly your Gini coefficient improves overnight. So we need to settle on a standard measure so we can stack organizations up. Another complexity around wage gap is, how do you measure wage gap across sectors? If you can imagine an investment bank versus a mine, they're going to have different wage gaps. You can't just stack up a ratio and say one's got a better wage gap than the other, because it doesn't play out. It's not true. How does a company pay responsibly without negatively impacting stakeholders? How do you reward contribution fairly is another thing that's good at grappling with. How can the remuneration strategy ensure equal opportunity to employees, particularly on focusing on pay in this instance? And how do you ensure that there's equal pay for equal value? What is equal value? And what are the changes in your organizations that you're going to ensure that there is equal value? You know, a good example is if you don't have a grading system that you use in the organization, how do you know what equal value is? And let's say you've got one organization who follows a broadband approach and another organization who uses, an example, because we're all HR folk here, a Patterson Classic. How do you compare equal value there where the range and size of job is so different? And then how do you set a minimum and a maximum level for that pay? So these are all things that need to be debated, and why it's so important to have a remuneration specialist either in the organization sitting on a remuneration committee or getting external advice on remuneration, because it's not just external equity at the end of the day that's important, and we see this playing out time and time again. Even if a problem manifests itself as an external equity problem, in other words, my company doesn't pay as much as the company across the road, I'm pretty sure, it's usually ends up being an internal equity problem where, you know, you're sitting around a coffee machine and people aren't supposed to talk about pay, but someone mentioned something and it misinterpreted, and it hasn't been explained properly, and the organization doesn't share pay scales and doesn't publish them to employees, and then you sit with this problem, and if you don't have a well-designed, well-communicated, transparent system around pay, it's very, very difficult to get around the issue. Two slides, just or three, just of the COVID impact on STR schemes. These were run probably about 6 weeks into our lockdown, which started at the end of March. What we're seeing is about a third of organizations continued with the STR scheme. But more important for me on this slide, if you look at the green and the blue bars, they're all over 50%. So more than half of organizations stopped their STR schemes, or canned them, or put them on hold immediately. If we look at the long-term incentive schemes, most organizations, for CEOs and executives, either continued or made changes. I can tell you the changes were pretty minor, except around the issuing of shares. So the scheme stayed in place, and that makes sense. It's about long-term stakeholder alignment, and it's around long-term sustainability of the organization. So I would argue that it's absolutely critical to keep the long-term incentive schemes in place. As long as we are ethical about the issuing of shares, these should stay in place. I read a very interesting article that was written this morning around organizations with appreciation type shares, so where you participate on the growth, and the number of those schemes that are underwater are quite frightening. So, you know, hopefully with a governance-driven vesting period, organizations are going to be able to recoup the value sitting in the long-term incentive schemes. I just want to see if I'm going to skim through this one. Okay, so we've gone through the first bullet. More discretion is being applied on STR schemes at higher occupational levels. I'm not overly surprised around that, in that employee retention and keeping the value deliverers on the boat at this time is becoming increasingly difficult. I don't think we've seen this play out anywhere close to where it's going to end up. So we actually don't have a firm view of what's going to happen in that space. Pardon me. And I think we've discussed everything else. Is everyone okay? I feel like I've been bumping my gums a whole lot here. I hope everyone's still engaged and not not falling asleep. Increased governance. I've just put that as a heading on the slide, because we are seeing an increase in governance. We are seeing an increase in governance before November last year, before anyone knew what a pandemic was. So this say on pay, this say on pay has had a big. Someone's mic on. Say on pay is, and there are a number of these in different countries. So say on pay is one example, and I'm going to give two examples of countries whose executive pay primarily is under a spotlight. The UK has got a say on pay, where the public can have a say on pay and hold executives accountable for the level of pay. Hold organizations on. Could we maybe pop your perfect. I think that's easier. So the UK can hold executives accountable and organizations accountable for rampant and irresponsible executive pay. Another interesting country is Australia, and they vote on a remuneration policy every single year. If they get 2 consecutive no votes, the entire board has to resign. It's legislated. Not the Remco. The board has to resign if they get 2 consecutive no votes on remuneration. In a more local context, this is absolutely the biggest change that I've seen in the governance space in remuneration since I've been back in South Africa for 15 years. And that is that what King says is that there are now 2 votes on remuneration. The first vote is on the policy, and the second vote is on the implementation of the policy. So in the past, there was just the one vote, and if executive pay was too high, I think shareholders were loath to vote it down because of the implications. Now what happens is you've got to get a 75% vote on both, or you've got to re-engage your stakeholders, and that's critical. In that it's a non-binding vote, but you are obliged to call a separate AGM and address the issues that were brought up in the no vote. So we're doing a whole lot of work and have been since about halfway through last year, where organizations are getting these no votes and don't know why they're getting them. And most of the no votes are coming from institutional shareholders who are looking at the measures of pay. A slight discomfort there is that a lot of the institutional shareholders are looking purely at returns, whereas that doesn't always, and that's because of where the nature of the shares and the shareholding. So it doesn't always talk to remuneration principles. They've definitely got an institutional shareholder cap on, but that's another debate. This has certainly given stakeholders a bigger baseball bat to ensure that the ethics are being followed. Next one, executive pays in spotlight before restructuring decisions. This has been accelerated greatly with COVID, where the first question that's being asked in every Section 189 or restructuring process is, have the executives had their pay cut? What are executives doing to feel the pain with the rest of the organization? And this is going to be around for a little while, and I think is actually something that's going to stick after COVID. Personally, inequality is getting a massive global focus at the moment, not just remuneration inequality, but racial inequality, gender inequality are all being driven through various forums on the global stage. And as I said, I want to end off the presentation on inequality and the wage gap. And here's my triple P, which stands for profit, planet, and people. And I find it easier than describing the triple bottom line and ESG measures and all this. I just like this because it's simple, and I'm not that smart. People, planet, and profit. So no longer are measures for bonus payouts at executive levels solely measuring profit. You've got to have a broader, more ethical measurement basket, and this is super exciting to me, because it ensures that you can't chase profits at the expense of people, and not just your people in your organization, people as in your community, people, the planet. You can't dump stuff into a river. You've got to have these socially responsible processes in place that are transparent and they're measurable, and they've got to feed into your remuneration payouts. And that's a great step for me. Let me just see something. We've all a bit tired of hearing of flattening the curve, so I thought I'd have a bit of a play on words here and just talk about flattening the inequality curve. I know that Namibia sits with a similar problem. South Africa is embarrassingly it's got the highest Gini coefficient of any other country in the whole world. So simply put, there is more inequality in South Africa than any country in the world. In fact, I went to a talk on inequality and the social ills that come out of inequality a while ago, and they asked what the 10 most unequal cities are in the world, and the audience were saying, Sao Paulo and a couple of other cities in Brazil. They threw a couple of South African cities into the mix. I can tell you they are Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, Pietermaritzburg, small towns in South Africa, and Brazil, a city I'd never heard of in Brazil, starting with an M, came in 10th. It was frightening. And the heartbreaking images that we've seen during this pandemic of people queuing for food, thousands of people queuing for food is going to live with me for a very long time. To frame it, and again, this is a South Africa view. Top 1%. In other words, the 19.2% of the wealth in South Africa is held by 1% of the population, and the top 10% of the wealthiest South Africans hold 65%, which leaves 35% for 90% of the population. Last couple of slides here, then you can have a break from me, I promise. Just to contextualize a Gini coefficient, the reason that a country like South Africa has got a high Gini coefficient is not because we've got unethical wage gap practices in organizations. There we stack up quite evenly. It's because of our rampant unemployment, and we personally sitting at 30.1% unemployed at the moment. But if you look at the employed figure, we are far more in line with organizations, if we stack up the actual wage gap, which is why I want to end on the last few slides, is that we need to settle on what a wage gap is. So the one that we prefer is just called a wage gap, and where we take the CEO pay, and then we look at the median pay of those familiar with Patterson, A, B, and C grades. So so from unskilled to skilled employees, and look at that median. So different structures and different sectors get smoothed, and then we can still look at a broader industry cut and look at a ratio that makes sense when comparing it. Another one is a 10-10 ratio. The top 10% of employees and the bottom 10% of employees. What this does is it takes out the anomalies where you've got perhaps an expat sitting as a CEO with a huge pay package. It smooths that a little bit. And the one that we all know is the Gini coefficient. And essentially what the Gini does is it takes this what's called the Lorenz curve, and it measures the space in that aeroplane wing looking graph, and the greater that space is, the greater the move away from the line of equality, and therefore greater the inequality. And that's it from me. Back to you, or if there are any questions.
Thank you, Craig. I think that was fantastic. Are there any questions? You're welcome to unmute yourself or type in the chat box. It looks like everybody's very happy.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question to Craig. May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Okay, so I noticed the word malice, and I'm trying to figure out, is that word just maliciousness, or is it actually acronym for something? Or is it a specific term that I couldn't figure out?
It is. I would imagine that it has got its roots in Latin, because it's a legal term. So yeah, as I said when I was talking through it, I don't even know how to pronounce it, let alone know the origins of the word. But that would be my guess, purely because it's a legal term.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I certainly need to investigate that a bit more, because this is something new for me. And what is so surprising, I work mainly in the financial industry, but where I would provide human resources skills. And I've seen that clawback is common for the last 2 decades. So it's quite interesting to note that it's coming into other industries and sectors as well.
Yeah, sure. So what we've experienced is that in pockets, clawbacks have been around. So that's why everyone understands what clawback means. But now this malice, I'll admit it was new to me, even though I've been doing this for a very long time. I'd never heard of malice until last year.
And any hints, where can I begin to educate myself? Just normally go to the platform for education, or is there a specific site you can refer me to?
Yeah, if you go and look at probably the best one would be IOD, which is the Institute of Directors here in South Africa. And what they did is they put practice notes together around King 4. So that principle that I read out was as high level as King goes. And then different organizations took a look at how to put practice notes together and define what fair and responsible pay actually was. And this is where it came out. So IOD is a good one, and SARA is another good one, the South African Reward Association. They've both got pretty good practice notes around remuneration. It's worth everyone taking a look at those anyway. Broader than malice, because it really does have some good, well thought out practices that you can apply in your organizations.
I'm just as much at a loss at what that word means as Gloria. So I've Googled the definition. I stuck it in the chat box there. Basically a financial penalty when an investment or a deal results in a loss.
Thank you for that. That was very sharp.
Great. So we're rolling around close to 11 o'clock. Sandrine, do you have a question?
I do actually. No. It was very interesting. Thank you, Craig. I just wanted to say that I think you were really spot on. 1 week ago or 2 weeks ago, I attended a presentation from a London Business School finance professor called Alex Edmonds. Is this young professor, has been in the top 40 under 40 professors on a global basis. And he presented on the concept, he has just written a book called Grow the Pie, and where he's saying that companies need to change their point of view, that if they focus on ESG metrics or topics, it will be at the expense of financial shareholders, and that on the contrary, it will help to grow the pie. And I remember reading an article about Al Gore, the former vice president of the United States, on The Atlantic magazine back maybe 5 years ago. After he finished touring the world talking about climate change, you know, he had I don't remember the name, a very famous presentation. He switched his focus a little bit on making investments. And so what he did is that he invested money, created an investment fund, and they only invested money for 10 years in companies that had good ESG practices. And what they demonstrated is that they consistently, over 10 years, beat all the best fund managers into the financial returns just by focusing on those organizations. And I think this is really, really important. And as HR people, and for me also as a component person, this is something that we need to get ourselves more acquainted with, because that will really, really be a massive change of what's going to happen in the coming years. Because as we see with COVID, we see with climate change, we see with the equality, as you were mentioning, of gender, of race, or whatever other types of, let's say, inclusion. This will be very important. So thank you so much for talking about that.
Wow, but thank you for those comments. As you can see, I'm looking off to the side just because I'm making notes here. I want to go and read that. The Al Gore one, I found that incredibly interesting. I mean, I knew he had a massive focus on climate change, but I really want to go and look at that investment idea. Thank you for that, Sandrine.
Great stuff. And thank you, Sandrine, also for joining us. I put in the chat box, our next Talent Cafe is on the 24th of July. We're going to be talking to Brian Mafosa from the Alpha Group International in South Africa about Leadership 360. Then we're crossing over to the States on the 7th of August. And then on the 21st of August, Sandrine is joining us to share with us some topic regarding remuneration that we are yet to finalize. But I'm looking forward to that, getting some international feedback and building a bit of momentum in the Talent Cafe. So Craig, thank you so much for joining us. Are there any other questions? Is there anybody else who would like to comment or ask a question before we close off and shut down for the day and wish everybody a happy weekend? Sandrine, you're already on the weekend because you're...
Yes, yes, it's Friday and Saturday.
Yeah. Great stuff. Right. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And,
thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's wonderful.
Thanks so much.